who got really interested in psychedelics to adjust stress, improve sleep, etc. Could mean weight training, could mean running. Let's talk about meditation. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to talk about what areas of the brain and body are active during meditation and after meditation, and why that can be so beneficial. We will also talk about when and how best to meditate. Now, this is a topic I've long been interested in. I was first given a book on meditation when I was in high school, because to make a long story short, it was a bit of a wild one early in my high school years. And as a consequence of a program that I was in, somebody handed me a book on meditation. That book is still available now. That book is called Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. He was one of the first, not the only, but one of the first people to really start popularizing meditation mindfulness practices in the United States. So this was in the late 1980s, and it was really only until recently that there were very few studies of meditation, although those really picked up in the 90s. Now you can find many, many thousands of studies on meditation and their mechanistic basis, so brain imaging studies, changes in hormones in the body. But in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s, because functional imaging of the brain, so-called MRI or fMRI, was really just starting to emerge as a popular tool in laboratories and hospitals, there really wasn't that much mechanistic understanding about how meditation worked. But of course, there was a deep understanding from cultures outside the United States that meditation was extremely useful. I should just mention, as long as we're talking about the history of meditation, any discussion about meditation is going to be a discussion about states of mind. And any discussion about states of mind invokes the word consciousness, a kind of a dangerous topic to get into in any format, because a lot of people talk about consciousness, but people use consciousness, the word, to mean different things. It doesn't have one standard operational definition, as scientists call it. However, discussions about consciousness are often part and parcel with conversations about things like psychedelics and kind of alternative therapies. And so in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, meditation and psychedelics were actually close cousins in the conversation about consciousness and states of mind. That conversation started to split into two different divisions, and I'll explain why in a moment. It gets to a little bit of interesting academic sociology. But what happened was there were a couple of guys at Harvard, including Timothy Leary and others, who got really interested in psychedelics, in particular LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. And at that time, that was part of the whole counterculture movement. It was considered very anti-establishment, and they were really encouraging students at Harvard to take LSD. They were also very interested in meditation, but what ended up happening is they essentially got kicked out or fired from Harvard. And there's a book that I'll refer you to in the show note captions if you're interested in learning more about all this. But they got kicked out and fired for their emphasis on psychedelics. Now, nowadays, there's a lot of interest in psychedelics. We've had episodes with Dr. Matthew Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, who's running clinical trials on psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD for the treatment of depression and PTSD. We've also had Dr. Nolan Williams on the podcast, my colleague at Stanford, who's doing incredible studies on some of those compounds as well. So nowadays, the conversation about psychedelics is coming back, and it's somewhat divorced from the conversation about meditation. But in the 1960s and 1970s, the conversation about psychedelics and meditation was sort of one and the same. That changed in the late 1980s and early 1990s when people like Jon Kabat-Zinn started writing books that were purely about meditation and suggesting that people explore meditative practices for the utility to bring calmness, adjust stress, improve sleep, etc., divorced from the conversation about psychedelics. Now, that's not to say that the scientific community immediately embraced the conversation about meditation. In fact, it took quite a long while for schools like Harvard and Stanford and other universities around the world to start embracing and funding studies of meditation, asking what sorts of brain areas are involved, how it changes the body, and perhaps most importantly, how a meditation practice can shift the brain and body when somebody is finished meditating and is off in their life doing their everyday things. In the late 1980s, and especially within the 1990s, the advent of brain imaging technology like magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, was a way to look at the brain while it was active, not just to get an image of its structure, but also how it's functioning, the areas that so-called light up. When all of that technology became accessible and popular, well, that allowed a large number of laboratories to start asking how specific patterns of thinking and breathing, maybe people sitting in the lotus position, but more often than that, it would be people inside of an MRI magnet, because it is a magnet, so it would put you into a little tube and push you into the tube, not against your will, of course, but put people into the tube, have them meditate, and then look at how the brain changed, and to do that over time. When those studies were done, what was discovered was really quite miraculous, really. And now we don't think of it as surprising, but what was discovered was a huge laundry list of brain changes. And then when people were evaluated in their outside life, so when they would fill out reports of their subjective feelings of happiness, or they would report their sleep, or even if objective measures were taken, like changes in hormones or markers of inflammation, etc., a large list of information fell out of that, which revealed that indeed there are many, a dozen or more, clear benefits of a regular meditation practice. And some of those meditation practices could be quite short. So nowadays we think of meditation as pretty commonly accepted. And in fact, that has a lot to do with the fact that many of the major tech companies in the Bay Area during the 2000s, such as Google and Apple and any number of different social media companies and other companies and business ventures, et cetera, and investment firms all over the world, started hiring people to train meditation or had online courses for meditation. So nowadays we think of meditation as this thing that almost everybody understands can benefit us. But we now sit at an interesting frontier where most people think of meditation as one thing, sort of like the word exercise, which of course could mean weight training, it could mean running, it could mean high intensity interval training, all of which, as you know, will get you different results depending on what you do, how often you do it, and the specifics of what you actually do. So too, meditation can give you very specific results. It can give you more focus. It can give you better sleep. It can give you a combination of results, just like exercise can, depending on the exercise. So what we're going to talk about next is the specific changes that happen in the brain with specific aspects of meditation. That is, what happens when you close your eyes? What happens when you focus your attention inward versus focusing your attention outward? Because as I mentioned before, there's third eye meditation where you close your eyes and focus on that spot just behind your forehead and you focus on your breathing. There's also meditation practices where you're focusing on what you're eating with a lot of so-called mindfulness, being very present to whatever's happening, not letting your mind wander or think about yesterday or tomorrow, what's happening next, but really focusing on the present. There are also meditation practices, of course, where you are in a format of interpersonal communication, where you're really listening very intensely. That too is a form of mindfulness. So we're going to parse each of these things, and we are going to ask what's happening in the brain and body during each of these meditation practices so that you can develop specific meditation practices that you can invoke in your real life on a daily basis, or thankfully, I would say for some who are pretty busy, that you could even do once a week or even once a month that will still clearly benefit you in specific ways.